At the beginning of the war, both sides were confident that they would win, and that it would be a relatively short struggle. Southern optimism was based upon a number of factors. They recognized that the task faced by the North was enormous. To conquer the vast expanses of the South would require a huge army and long supply lines, factors that favored the defense. Perhaps even more importantly, they believed that their control over cotton production would bring the North to its knees. Without Southern cotton, they argued, Northern textile mills could not operate. Likewise, Northern commerce would shut down, having lost the revenue from shipping Southern cotton overseas. They also fully expected that Great Britain would come to support the Confederacy. Almost 80% of the cotton used by the huge British textile industry came from the South, and Southern leaders reasoned that this would force the British government to intervene on their behalf. Northerners, on the other hand, enjoyed tremendous advantages in terms of men and resources. The Union states had over 4 times the potential military manpower of the Confederacy. It had similar overwhelming advantages in terms of industrial production, without which it would prove difficult to produce the armaments necessary for war. As it turned out, Southern confidence in the power of King Cotton was mistaken. While the British toyed with the idea of intervention, they ultimately settled upon a policy of neutrality, replacing much of the cotton that had come from the United States with imports from India. Nor were the northern industries and commerce brought to their knees. While the textile industry did suffer, federal wartime spending actually spurred economic growth in the North, and trade with Europe boomed. Trying to mobilize Southern resources to fight the war proved frustrating as well. The limited agrarian character of the Southern economy was a significant problem. Prior to the war, the region's key source of wealth had been the export of cotton, with most manufactured goods being purchased from the North or from Europe. During the war, however, this export trade was largely halted by a Union naval blockade. With little economic activity to tax, the Confederate government was forced to issue a flood of worthless paper currency, which in turn sparked out-of-control inflation. Efforts to rapidly industrialize bore some fruit, but the South remained far behind the North. Many in the South resented the heavy-handed measures adopted by their central government. With limited cash available, the Confederate Congress authorized officials to seize necessary materials, such as food, horses, and slaves, from private citizens. There was compensation, but it was in devalued Confederate currency. 10% of all crops were taken as a tax in kind, rather than cash. The Confederacy also authorized the first wartime conscription act in U.S. history, with all men between the ages of 18 and 35 liable to being drafted into the Army. This was later expanded to all men between the ages of 17 and 50. With the region's traditional emphasis upon states' rights and limited government, the states often proved reluctant to comply with the demands coming from Richmond, the Confederate capital. These economic problems not only made it difficult for the Confederacy to prosecute the war, but also caused dire suffering amongst its people, particularly the poorer classes. The limited white manpower of the South was siphoned off into the Army, leaving women and children to do most of the work. Inflation, government confiscation, and the turmoil of war made it difficult for many families to even find enough food to eat. The poorer folk also came to deeply resent what they saw as special privileges being given to the elite planter class. The draft law contained provisions that allowed the wealthy to hire a substitute to fight in their place. It also exempted one white male on every plantation with 20 or more slaves. The government's idea was to ensure that the plantations continued to operate, but many ordinary Southerners viewed this simply as the wealthy avoiding service. The North faced its own problems. While able to field a large army amply supplied by Northern industries, Union generals proved unable to conquer the South. Attempts to invade Virginia and capture the Confederate capital at Richmond were turned back by smaller Confederate armies. This reflected not only the advantages the South enjoyed as the defender, but also clearly superior military leadership. The only advances the Union could point to were in the Western theater, particularly along the Mississippi. It was this western struggle that would ultimately provide the commanders necessary for Union victory. Economically, the North did much better than the South. Federal spending accelerated industrialization, and with a Union army requiring large numbers of able-bodied men, unemployment virtually vanished. As in the South, women were drawn increasingly into the labor force, both on the farm and in factories. Unlike the South, the Northern farming economy prospered during the war. Wartime orders and growing trade with Europe more than compensated for the loss of trade with the South, while the scarcity of manpower was addressed by the rapid adoption of farm machinery produced by booming northern factories. The war also opened the door to some significant changes in domestic policy. During the war, the Democrats, with their traditional ideas of limited government and states' rights, were reduced to a minority. Republicans, spiritual descendants of Alexander Hamilton, took advantage of this to carry out a program of aggressive government intervention in the economy. Some of these were strictly wartime measures, such as the creation of a national draft to supply the army with men, but others had significant long-term ramifications. The National Bank Act of 1864 created a system of federally chartered banks, overseen by a national comptroller of the currency. The federal comptroller was empowered to regulate the lending and investing activities of these national banks. Each would have the power to issue standardized national banknotes based on United States bonds held by the bank. This law essentially eliminated the ability of state banks to issue money, ensuring that there was a single federal currency. Congress also sought to use federal resources to support the expansion of the country's transportation system. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 offered heavy federal subsidies for the completion of a transcontinental railroad that would tie the West Coast firmly to the rest of the country. In the decades to come, the federal government would continue to invest heavily in transportation projects, ensuring that the market revolution would reach every corner of the country. To pay for the war, Congress passed the Internal Revenue Act, which significantly raised taxes, including for the first time a tax on income. These new taxes were administered by a new federal agency titled the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the agency that would later become the Internal Revenue Service. Since the Federalist era, the followers of Hamilton had argued for strong protective tariffs to encourage domestic manufacturing. Even before the war, there had been significant taxes on imports, but these tariffs soared during the war years, helping to defray some of the costs of the conflict. These policies would continue into the 20th century, with Congress continuing to erect significant tariff barriers to protect domestic industries. The federal government also sought to encourage educational development through the Morrill Act of 1862. It set aside public lands to support universities that emphasize agriculture and mechanical arts, land-grant colleges. In California, for instance, this laid the basis for the University of California system. Finally, the Homestead Act offered 160 acres of public land to settlers who would live and labor on it. The goal was to ensure that everyone had the opportunity to grasp the American dream of economic independence. Ultimately, it did help create 1 million new family farms. But in the long run, this program had mixed results. A large number of these homesteaded farms failed, and land speculators found it relatively easy to manipulate the terms of the act to accumulate vast estates, clearly not what had been intended by Congress.